A rookie police officer, fresh out of the academy, stood tall with a puffed-up chest and a sharp uniform. His name was Officer Ryan Carter, a young man with ambitions as high as the stars, but an attitude that outpaced his experience. He was the kind of officer who believed that authority wasn't earned, it was taken. His jawline was sharp, his confidence sharper, but there was an edge to him that didn't sit right with everyone who crossed his path. One overcast morning, Officer Carter found himself in a courtroom for the first time since joining the force. He'd issued a ticket to a man he swore was speeding through a school zone. The man had protested the ticket vehemently, claiming innocence, and requested a day in court. Officer Carter saw it as a chance to prove himself, perhaps a little too much so. The courtroom was busy, with a hum of murmurs as people shuffled through the seats, waiting for their cases to be called. At the center of it all sat Judge Olivia Bennett, a woman whose reputation carried the weight of decades of fairness and wisdom. She was one of the youngest judges to ever sit on the bench when she was appointed years ago, and her rulings were legendary for their balance of justice and empathy. But more than that, Judge Bennett was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, especially when dealing with arrogance. The officer and the judge couldn't have been more different. Where Carter's youth wrought a sense of invincibility, Judge Bennett's years had taught her the importance of humility. She'd faced countless egos in her courtroom, but there was something about Carter's demeanor that struck her immediately. He walked in with a swagger, his hat slightly tilted and his tone just a little too loud as he addressed her. "Your Honor," he began, standing stiffly at attention, "I'm here to present my case, and I'd like to make it clear that the defendant was absolutely in the wrong." Judge Bennett raised a brow, leaning forward slightly as if to examine this young officer more closely. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm, "in this courtroom, we deal in facts, not assumptions. Are you prepared to present your evidence?" "Absolutely, Your Honor," Carter said, his tone clipped, almost challenging. He glanced at the defendant, a middle-aged black man named Marcus Hughes, who sat quietly at the defense table. Marcus had an air of quiet strength about him, a man who didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. He simply watched the young officer, his expression unreadable. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Officer Carter had taken liberties in his report. His claims were bold, but his evidence was thin. Judge Bennett began asking questions, pointed, precise, and designed to uncover the truth. Carter's confidence wavered slightly, but he doubled down, unwilling to admit any fault. "The radar reading," Judge Bennett said, her tone measured, "shows a speed of 27 miles per hour, which is within the posted limit. Can you explain why you issued the ticket?" Carter stiffened. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe the radar might have been malfunctioning." Judge Bennett's eyes narrowed. "You believed asterisk. Officer Carter, this isn't about beliefs. This is about facts. Was the radar tested for accuracy?" Carter hesitated, a faint flush rising to his cheeks. "No, Your Honor, but Before he could finish, Judge Bennett held up a hand. "Officer Carter, let me remind you that this is a court of law, not a training exercise. Your authority as an officer is not a blank check. It must be backed by evidence and integrity." The courtroom was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Carter's jaw clenched, his pride clearly stung. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he saw as an obstacle rather than an ally. Marcus Hughes finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to ask the officer something directly." Judge Bennett nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Hughes." Marcus turned to Carter, his gaze steady. "Officer, when you stopped me, did you ask me any questions about where I was coming from or where I was headed? Or did you just assume I was guilty?" Carter bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. "I don't assume, sir. I enforce the law." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And yet, here we are." Judge Bennett observed the exchange carefully, her sharp mind piecing together the dynamics at play. It wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, I suggest you take a moment to consider what it means to serve justice, because right now, it seems you're more concerned with proving a point than upholding the truth." Carter's face reddened, but before he could respond, the bailiff approached the bench with a note. Judge Bennett read it quickly, her expression unreadable, then looked up. "What happens next?" she said, her voice low and steady. "Will determine the course of not just this case, but perhaps your career, Officer Carter. I suggest you choose your words carefully." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the rookie officer's response, but his lips pressed into a thin line. His silence was deafening, and the weight of the moment hung in the air. What would he say? Would he double down, risking everything, or finally confront the hard truth Judge Bennett had laid before him? The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation, and the outcome was far from certain. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Officer Carter to speak. The young officer, however, was locked in an internal struggle. His instinct was to defend himself, to assert his authority, but Judge Bennett's piercing gaze made him pause. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, he realized that this was no ordinary confrontation. This wasn't just about a ticket or even his pride. It was about something far greater, something he didn't quite understand yet. Judge Bennett leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. She had seen this kind of defiance before, not just in police officers, but in lawyers, witnesses, and even defendants. It was the kind of attitude that came from insecurity disguised as confidence, and she knew that breaking through it required patience. She wouldn't let this young man derail the principles of her courtroom, but she also wasn't interested in humiliating him. Justice wasn't about tearing people down, it was about uncovering the truth. "Officer Carter," she said finally, her tone steady but firm, "I'm giving you one last opportunity to clarify your actions. Did you follow the proper procedures when issuing this ticket?" Carter's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He looked at Marcus Hughes, who sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that unsettled Carter. It was as though Marcus knew something he didn't, something he wasn't ready to face. Carter's mind raced, trying to recall the sequence of events that had led them all to this moment. It had been an ordinary afternoon when he'd spotted Marcus's car, a sleek, black sedan that Carter had immediately associated with trouble. He hadn't been able to explain it, but something about the way the car moved through the neighborhood had set off alarm bells in his head. Maybe it was the tinted windows, or maybe it was the fact that it didn't seem to belong in the area. Either way, he'd flipped on his lights and pulled the car over, already convinced he'd find something suspicious. When he approached the driver's side window, Marcus had been calm and polite. Too calm, Carter had thought at the time. The man's composure had seemed almost mocking, as though he wasn't taking Carter seriously. And when Marcus questioned the reason for the stop, Carter's irritation had flared. Instead of answering,
But now,
he issued the
standing
ticket,
in this courtroom,
confident that
Carter
was in
couldn't
the right. Shake the feeling that he'd missed something. He glanced at the radar report again, the numbers staring back at him like an accusation. Judge Bennett was right. He had no evidence to back up his claims, and yet, admitting that felt like admitting defeat. "Your Honor," Carter said finally, his voice tight, "I followed my instincts. I believed the driver was speeding, and I acted accordingly." Judge Bennett's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, disappointment, perhaps. She tapped her pen against her notebook, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Instincts," she repeated, her tone measured. "Officer Carter, instincts have their place in law enforcement, but they cannot replace evidence. When you issue a ticket, you are making an accusation, and when you make an accusation, you bear the burden of proof. Do you understand that?" Carter nodded stiffly, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his frustration. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who seemed so sure of themselves. He looked around the courtroom, hoping for some sign of support, but the faces in the audience were unreadable. Even Marcus Hughes remained calm, his expression giving nothing away. "Mr. Hughes," Judge Bennett said, turning her attention to the defendant, "you mentioned earlier that you'd like to ask Officer Carter a question. Do you have any additional comments or concerns you'd like to share?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands still folded on the table. His voice was steady, with a quiet strength that commanded attention. Your Honor, I just want to make sure we're all here for the same reason. I'm not trying to undermine the officer or disrespect the law. But I do believe that justice isn't about who has the loudest voice or the most authority. It's about finding the truth. Judge Bennett nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's precisely why we're here, Mr. Hughes. The truth is what matters most. Carter bristled at Marcus's words, his pride flaring again. With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't think it's fair to suggest that I'm not interested in the truth. I became a police officer to serve and protect. And that's exactly what I was doing when I issued that ticket. Judge Bennett's gaze hardened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she let Carter's words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Officer Carter, she said, her voice calm but firm, nobody is questioning your intentions. What we are questioning is whether your actions were justified. And right now, the evidence doesn't support your claim. I need you to understand the gravity of that. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at the radar report again, the numbers blurring in front of his eyes. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, not just about the ticket, but about himself. Had he let his assumptions cloud his judgment? Had he been so focused on proving himself that he'd lost sight of what really mattered? Marcus Hughes watched the young officer closely, his expression still calm, but now tinged with a hint of sadness. He'd seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind that came from insecurity and fear. And while he didn't relish the idea of watching Carter struggle, he also knew that moments like this were necessary. Growth didn't come from comfort, it came from challenge. The tension in the courtroom continued to build, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, but the outcome was far from clear. Would Officer Carter admit his mistake and take responsibility, or would he dig in his heels and risk everything? And what about Marcus Hughes? Was there more to his story than he was letting on? Or was he simply an innocent man caught in the crossfire of someone else's ambition? Judge Bennett glanced at the clock, then back at the two men in front of her. We're going to take a short recess, she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. When we return, I expect both parties to be prepared to present their final arguments. This case will not be decided on assumptions or egos, it will be decided on facts. With that, she banged her gavel and stood, leaving the courtroom in a buzz of whispers and speculation. Carter watched her go, his mind racing. He had less than 15 minutes to figure out his next move, and the weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. The courtroom emptied slowly as people filed out for the recess, the murmurs of quiet conversations filling the air. Officer Carter stayed behind, gripping the edge of the table as though it could ground him in the middle of his swirling thoughts. He wasn't sure what stung more, Judge Bennett's pointed questioning or the calm, almost patient way Marcus Hughes seemed to observe him. Carter wasn't used to feeling small. He was used to control, to authority, to being the one who set the tone. But here, in this room, none of that seemed to matter. Across the room, Marcus remained seated, seemingly unbothered by the break. He was jotting something down on a notepad, his movements unhurried, as though the weight of the situation didn't faze him. Carter found himself watching the man, trying to piece together the enigma that sat so comfortably in the defendant's chair. Marcus wasn't what Carter had expected. He wasn't defensive or angry. He was composed, thoughtful, and almost understanding. It was unnerving. Judge Bennett had retreated to her chambers, and Carter could only imagine what she was thinking. Did she already have a decision in mind? Was she going to use this case to make an example of him? The thought sent a jolt of panic through him. This wasn't just about a single ticket anymore. This was about his career, his reputation, his future. If he walked out of here branded as reckless or unprofessional, it would follow him for years. The academy had drilled into him the importance of respect, but respect was the last thing he felt he was earning in this moment. As the minutes ticked by, Carter's mind wandered back to the day he'd stopped Marcus. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he'd made the right call, but now, under the weight of scrutiny, he wasn't so sure anymore. Had he been influenced by something other than the facts? The thought made his stomach churn, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now. Marcus, meanwhile, was thinking about his own day that had led to the ticket. He'd been running late to pick up his daughter from school, his mind preoccupied with work deadlines and family obligations. When the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, his first thought had been confusion. He wasn't speeding, and he knew it. But the moment Carter approached his car, Marcus had felt the shift in energy. The young officer had looked at him not as a man but as a potential problem. And that realization had cut deep. It wasn't the first time Marcus had felt that weight, but it never got easier. The break ended sooner than anyone expected, and the courtroom quickly filled again. Judge Bennett returned, her presence commanding the room without a word. She took her seat, her sharp gaze sweeping over everyone before landing on Carter. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice steady. "Before we continue, I want to remind you that this is your opportunity to clarify your actions and present any additional evidence. Do you have anything else to add to your report?" Carter hesitated, his palms sweating. He glanced at Marcus, then back at Judge Bennett. "Your Honor," he began, his voice quieter than before, "I don't have additional evidence, but I stand by my belief that the stop was justified." Judge Bennett tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "And why is that, Officer Carter? If the radar indicated the driver was within the speed limit, and you have no other evidence of wrongdoing, what exactly led you to issue the ticket?" Carter swallowed hard. I thought there was something off about the situation. The car, the way it was moving, it just didn't feel right." Judge Bennett's gaze sharpened. "So you acted on a feeling, not on facts." "It wasn't just a feeling," Carter said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "It was experience. It was instinct. That's what we're trained to do." Judge Bennett leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the bench. "Officer Carter, instinct is not a substitute for evidence. And if your so-called experience leads you to make assumptions that aren't grounded in facts, then it's not experience at all, it's bias." The word hit Carter like a slap, and his face flushed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus spoke first. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm, "if I may, I'd like to say something." Judge Bennett nodded, gesturing for him to continue. Marcus turned to face Carter directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Officer Carter," he said, "I'm not here to make your life harder. I understand that your job isn't easy, but I need you to understand something too. When you stopped me that day, I wasn't just a driver. I was a father trying to get to his daughter on time. I was a man trying to make it through his day like anyone else. And when you looked at me, you didn't see any of that. You didn't see me. You saw what you wanted to see." Carter felt his chest tighten, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but something about Marcus's tone stopped him. It wasn't accusatory, it was honest, raw, and deeply personal. "Every decision you make out there," Marcus continued, "affects real people. And when you let your assumptions guide you instead of the facts, you risk doing more harm than good. I don't think you're a bad person, Officer Carter, but I do think you have a lot to learn." The room was silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Judge Bennett watched Carter closely, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't here to punish him. She was here to hold him accountable. And as much as she wanted to see him grow from this experience, she couldn't force him to change. That was something he had to choose for himself. "Officer Carter," she said finally, breaking the silence, "I want you to think very carefully about your next words. This is your opportunity to take responsibility for your actions and to show this court, and yourself, that you are capable of growth. What do you have to say?" Carter's heart raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He looked at Marcus, at Judge Bennett, at the faces of the people in the courtroom. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of his choices, the ripple effect they had on everyone around him. But whether he was ready to confront that truth was another matter entirely. The air was thick with anticipation, and all eyes were on him as the next chapter of this story teetered on the edge of uncertainty. The room felt suffocating as Officer Carter shifted uncomfortably. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts, each competing for dominance. He could feel the weight of Marcus's words, the unspoken judgment in the room, and the piercing gaze of Judge Bennett, who waited with calm intensity. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that he wasn't prepared for. Carter took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Your Honor," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would get this far." Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow, her pen hovering over her notepad. "What do you mean by that, Officer Carter?" He hesitated, glancing at Marcus. "When I stopped him that day, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I saw something suspicious and I acted on it. But maybe I was wrong." The admission hung in the air, a fragile thing that could shatter with the wrong move. The courtroom murmured softly, the audience sensing a shift in the tide. Marcus sat still, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a glimmer of hope that Carter was starting to understand. Judge Bennett leaned forward, her voice softer, but no less commanding. "Officer Carter, do you understand the impact of your actions? Do you understand what it means to misuse your authority, even unintentionally?" Carter nodded, though the movement was small, almost reluctant. "I think I do, Your Honor. But it wasn't about power or trying to target anyone. I thought I was protecting the community." Marcus cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. "Protecting the community," he said, his tone even, "is a noble goal. But who do you see as part of that community, Officer Carter? People like me? Or only the ones who fit your idea of what's normal or safe?" The question hit harder than Carter expected, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words to respond. He wanted to say that he didn't see Marcus any differently, that his actions weren't about race or bias. But deep down, he wasn't sure that was entirely true. That uncertainty gnawed at him, making him feel exposed in a way he never had before. Judge Bennett watched the young officer carefully, her keen eyes taking in every nuance of his demeanor. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "this isn't just about you. It's about the trust people place in law enforcement, the trust they have in the justice system. Every decision you make has consequences, not just for you, but for the people you're sworn to serve." Carter's jaw tightened, the words sinking in like a stone. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who stood on the right side of the law. But now, faced with the possibility that he had been wrong, that he had caused harm instead of good, he felt that identity begin to crumble. And as much as he hated to admit it, Marcus's words rang true. He hadn't seen Marcus that day. He'd seen a version of him shaped by assumptions. And that realization was almost too much to bear. The room grew heavier with silence, each second stretching into an eternity. Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way Carter expected. Instead, there was a deep sadness in his eyes, a weariness that came from years of being misunderstood and judged. "I want to believe," Marcus said quietly, addressing both Carter and the court, "that we can do better. That people like me can be seen for who we are, not for what people assume we might be." But every time something like this happens, it gets harder to hold on to that hope. Judge Bennett's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "Mr. Hughes, your words carry great weight. And they're not just for Officer Carter, they're for all of us. We must do better, not just in this courtroom, but in every interaction, every decision. That's how we build trust. That's how we create real justice." Carter swallowed hard, his throat dry. The pressure of the moment was almost unbearable, but he couldn't walk away now. He had to see this through, even if it meant confronting parts of himself he wasn't ready to face. "Your Honor," he said finally, his voice steadying, "I don't know if I can fix what I've done, but I want to try. I want to learn from this." The words weren't perfect, but they were sincere, and they seemed to shift something in the room. Marcus studied Carter for a long moment, then gave a small nod, as though acknowledging the effort, however incomplete it might be. Judge Bennett took a deep breath, her sharp mind weighing every detail of the case, every word spoken. She could feel the tension in the room reaching its peak, the air electric with anticipation. The moment of reckoning was near, and everyone could feel it. But before she could speak, the courtroom door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside, her face pale with urgency. She clutched a folder tightly to her chest, her eyes darting around until they landed on Judge Bennett. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something that might change everything." All eyes turned to her, the suspense thick and almost unbearable. Carter's heart pounded in his chest, and Marcus's calm demeanor faltered for the first time as he exchanged a glance with his attorney. Judge Bennett motioned for the woman to approach, her expression unreadable but her curiosity piqued. The woman handed over the folder, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry for the interruption, but I couldn't ignore this. It's important." Judge Bennett opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. Her expression shifted subtly, just enough to signal that whatever was inside was significant. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "What I'm holding," she said slowly, her voice carrying a weight that made the room fall silent, "may alter the trajectory of this case. But before I proceed, I need to ensure that all parties are ready to face what comes next." The tension in the room was palpable, every person on edge as they waited for her to reveal what she had found. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome was still shrouded in uncertainty. Whatever was about to happen, it would change everything, and no one in that courtroom would leave unaffected. Judge Bennett's fingers hovered over the folder, her expression as unreadable as ever, but her silence was heavy with implications. The courtroom was motionless, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. All eyes remained on her, waiting for her next words. Marcus Hughes leaned slightly forward, his brow furrowing as if trying to read the judge's mind. Officer Carter, on the other hand, felt his stomach twist with anxiety. Whatever was in that folder could either exonerate him or seal his fate, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Finally, Judge Bennett looked up, her voice calm but deliberate. "Before I share the contents of this file, I need to ask one more time. Officer Carter, is there anything else you'd like to disclose regarding the events of that day? This is your chance to speak freely." Carter's pulse raced as the judge's question hung in the air. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What was there to say? He had already admitted his doubts, his mistakes. What more could he offer? He shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor, I've told you everything I can." Judge Bennett nodded once, her expression still unreadable. She placed the folder on her desk, her hand resting on top of it. "Very well," she said, her tone measured. "This document was submitted by an independent investigator who reviewed the footage from Officer Carter's dash cam and body cam. The findings are unexpected." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Marcus's attorney whispered something to him, but Marcus didn't react. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, his jaw tight. Carter's heart sank. He hadn't even thought about the dashcam footage since the day of the stop. Had it captured something he missed? Or worse, something that confirmed Marcus's claims? Judge Bennett gestured toward the court clerk. "Please distribute the transcripts of the footage to both parties," she instructed. The clerk quickly moved to hand out copies, the shuffling of paper breaking the tense silence. Carter took his copy with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the words. His stomach dropped as he read the transcript. The footage revealed more than just the stop itself. It captured Carter's radio call moments before he pulled Marcus over. In the call, Carter described Marcus's car as suspicious, though he provided no clear reason why. Worse still, his tone suggested a bias he hadn't realized he was broadcasting. Phrases like "doesn't fit" and "probably something off" were scattered throughout the audio, painting a picture that was difficult to defend. Carter's face burned with shame as he read. He could feel the weight of the courtroom's collective gaze on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look up. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a revelation of something far deeper, something that cut to the core of who he was and how he saw the world. Marcus's attorney stood, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, this evidence speaks volumes. It confirms what Mr. Hughes has been saying all along, that this stop wasn't based on facts or evidence, but on assumptions and prejudice." Carter's head snapped up, his instinct to defend himself flaring, but Judge Bennett raised a hand to silence the room. "We'll address that argument shortly," she said. "But there's more." She turned the page of the report, her eyes scanning the next section. The footage also captured an interaction after the ticket was issued. Officer Carter, do you recall returning to Mr. Hughes's vehicle after you handed him the citation? Carter's brow furrowed. He thought back to that day, trying to piece together every moment. I think I went back to remind him about the court date, he said hesitantly. Judge Bennett nodded. According to the footage, during that interaction, you made a comment about keeping an eye out for Mr. Hughes. Do you recall saying that? Carter's heart sank. The words came rushing back to him, clear as day. He hadn't meant anything by them. At least, that's what he told himself at the time. But now, in the context of everything else, they sounded damning. Yes, Your Honor, he said quietly. I do remember. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with frustration. That comment wasn't just unnecessary, it was a warning. It made me feel like I wasn't just being ticketed but being marked. The room fell into a heavy silence. Judge Bennett took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. Officer Carter, she said, her tone sharp, this is your opportunity to explain yourself. If there's any context or intent behind your actions that hasn't been addressed, now is the time. Carter opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? He told himself he was just doing his job, that he was protecting the community. But now, faced with the evidence and Marcus's calm but pointed accusations, he wasn't so sure. The silence stretched, the tension in the room becoming almost unbearable. Then, unexpectedly, Marcus spoke again. Your Honor, I don't think Officer Carter is a bad person, he said, his voice softer now. But this isn't just about him or me. It's about the systems and attitudes that allow things like this to happen. If we don't address those, this cycle will keep repeating. Judge Bennett nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. You're right, Mr. Hughes. This case is about more than one incident. It's about accountability, understanding, and change. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, the weight of the moment sinking in. But before Judge Bennett could continue, the young woman who had delivered the folder stepped forward again. Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling slightly. There's one more piece of evidence you need to see. It's from a bystander who recorded the stop on their phone. The footage provides a different angle, one that might change how we view this case. The judge's eyes narrowed, her curiosity clearly piqued. Very well, she said. Let's review the footage. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point as everyone braced for what the new video might reveal. Marcus exchanged a glance with his attorney, and even Carter couldn't hide the mixture of dread and curiosity on his face. Whatever came next, it was clear that the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was still as the bailiff wheeled in a small monitor, the screen flickering to life. Judge Bennett gestured for the video to play, her expression calm but focused. All eyes turned to the screen as the footage began. The bystander's angle showed Marcus's car parked on the shoulder, Officer Carter standing rigidly beside it. The audio crackled, but it was clear enough to catch the exchange between the two men. Carter's voice was firm but clipped, and the comment about keeping an eye out was unmistakable. But what followed was the moment that shifted everything. As Carter turned to walk away, the camera captured a faint smirk on his face, one that seemed almost satisfied. The courtroom collectively inhaled, the atmosphere charged with disbelief. Marcus's attorney broke the silence first. Your Honor, that smirk speaks volumes. It shows intent, perhaps even malice, in Officer Carter's actions. This wasn't about community safety. This was personal. Carter's head snapped up, his face pale. That's not true. He blurted, his voice shaking. I wasn't. It wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to target him. Judge Bennett held up a hand, silencing the room. Officer Carter, you've had multiple opportunities to clarify your actions. This footage adds another layer to the narrative, one that demands accountability. But before I make my ruling, I'd like to hear from you one final time. Do you have anything to say? Carter felt the weight of the room bearing down on him. His career, his integrity, his future, it all hung in the balance. He opened his mouth, his voice trembling. Your Honor, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing my job, but But I see now that I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I'm sorry. To Mr. Hughes, to this court, to everyone, I'm truly sorry. Marcus's gaze softened slightly, but his posture remained firm. Apologies are a start, Officer Carter, but they don't erase what happened. They don't undo the fear or the humiliation. Judge Bennett leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Apologies are indeed a start, but actions speak louder than words. And this court must determine what actions are necessary to ensure justice is served. Just as the judge was about to deliver her ruling, the courtroom door opened once more. A tall man in a sharp suit stepped inside, his face calm but serious. He carried another folder and moved quickly to the bench, whispering to the clerk. The clerk's eyes widened, and he handed the document to Judge Bennett. Your Honor, the man said, his voice steady, I represent the Internal Affairs Division. This document contains a report regarding Officer Carter's past conduct. The courtroom buzzed again as Judge Bennett flipped through the pages, her face remaining impassive. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable. Officer Carter, she said, her tone sharp, it appears this isn't the first time you've acted on assumptions rather than evidence. According to this report, you've had multiple complaints filed against you, complaints that, while not severe enough to warrant disciplinary action on their own, show a troubling pattern. Carter's face drained of color. He had hoped those complaints, dismissed as minor misunderstandings, would never resurface. But here they were, laid bare for all to see. Judge Bennett closed the folder and took a deep breath. This case has revealed not only the failures of one officer, but also the larger systemic issues at play. Mr. Hughes, you have shown remarkable restraint and courage throughout this process. And Officer Carter, while your apology is noted, the pattern of behavior outlined here cannot be ignored. The room held its collective breath as the judge continued. The court rules in favor of Mr. Hughes. The ticket and all related charges are dismissed. Additionally, I am ordering a formal review of Officer Carter's conduct by Internal Affairs. It is clear that further training and evaluation are necessary. Carter slumped in his seat, the weight of the ruling hitting him like a tidal wave. He had thought this was just another case, a routine procedure, but now he was faced with the reality that his actions carried consequences far beyond his intentions. Before the judge could dismiss the court, Marcus stood. Your Honor, if I may, he said, his voice calm but firm. Judge Bennett gestured for him to speak. I don't take pleasure in seeing someone's career put on the line, Marcus said, his gaze shifting to Carter. What I want isn't revenge. It's change. If Officer Carter is willing to truly listen, to learn, and to grow, then I believe something good can come from all this. The courtroom was silent as Marcus's words sank in. Carter looked at him, his expression a mix of shame and gratitude. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. Judge Bennett nodded in approval. Mr. Hughes, your perspective is commendable. Let's hope that this case serves as a catalyst for change, not just for Officer Carter, but for everyone involved. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the hearing, Carter felt a strange mix of relief and regret. He had lost, but in losing, he had gained a chance to confront the truth about himself. And as he looked at Marcus, he realized that this wasn't just the end of a case. It was the beginning of a journey he hadn't known he needed to take.